Les reitero la necesidad de mantener teléfonos celulares en silencio durante el desarrollo de esta jornada, así evitamos interrupciones. Muchas gracias. Muy buenas tardes. Damos inicio a esta ceremonia tan significativa para la Facultad y para la Universidad de Chile, que reúne a toda su comunidad universitaria. Estudiantes, profesores y egresados de esta casa de estudios se reencuentran en esta actividad que da inicio oficial a sus actividades académicas 2026. Como es tradición, en esta ceremonia invitamos a grandes expositores para que nos iluminen, nos entusiasmen y nos conecten con temas de alta relevancia nacional e internacional en las áreas de la economía, los negocios, sistemas de información, control de gestión y muchos otros. El año pasado tuvimos en este mismo escenario a Philippe Aghion, candidato a Premio Nobel de Economía, que ese mismo año lo recibió. Hoy tenemos el honor de contar con un gran expositor que también fue reconocido con el Premio Nobel de Economía en 2021. Él es Guido Imbens, profesor de la Universidad de Stanford y uno de los economistas más influyentes de su generación. Ha desarrollado herramientas que permiten medir con rigor el impacto real de políticas públicas y decisiones económicas en la sociedad. Invitamos al decano, profesor José de Gregorio, a dar la bienvenida oficial a esta ceremonia y a presentar a nuestro invitado.
Muchas gracias. Buenos días. El inicio del año académico es una actividad bien importante para nosotros, ¿no es cierto? Es cuando iniciamos formalmente nuestras actividades y una oportunidad para reunirnos profesores, alumnos, exalumnos. Y también es una oportunidad de escuchar a alguien que nos motive mucho y que nos influya en cosas que estamos pensando. Y nuevamente tenemos a un destacadísimo economista dando la inauguración del año académico este año. Aportes tan importantes a la economía que el año 2021 lo hicieron merecedor del Premio Nobel, ¿no es cierto? Su investigación abordó los temas de causalidad, temas que son bastante comunes en nuestra vida y bastante confusos. Por ejemplo, nosotros tenemos problemas de correlación espuria. Entonces juntamos dos variables que se mueven igual y cualquiera dice no, una causa a la otra y es totalmente espurio, ¿no es cierto? Por ejemplo, buscando ejemplos, las ventas y la publicidad durante Navidad. Hay un factor externo que se llama Navidad, que todos compramos harto y se hace harta publicidad, pero no hay causalidad. También hay causalidad reversa, ¿no es cierto? Gente más de mayores ingresos tiene mejor salud. Pero también es al revés, gente más saludable puede trabajar más duro, ser más productiva, ¿no es cierto? Y también respecto a la causalidad, también tenemos una observación aquí en la FEN. El año pasado tuvimos el honor de tener a Philippe Aghion como presentador de la inauguración del año académico. Y pocos meses después ganó el Premio Nobel, ¿no es cierto? Este año viene Guido, pero él ganó el Premio Nobel el año 2021, por lo tanto no hay causalidad. Pero no es tan así. Si ustedes investigan con cuidado, Guido vino antes, vino el año 2017, antes de ganar el Nobel. Por lo tanto tenemos dos observaciones, Guido y Philippe, y posterior Premio Nobel. Todavía nos faltan más observaciones, obviamente es mucho más lo que uno tiene que hacer para poder determinar la causalidad, pero seguiremos investigando y seguiremos haciendo esfuerzos por traer gente tan destacada como Guido. Pero Guido además tiene otra característica, él no habla castellano, but I told him that I was going to make this comment today. So, él también es Scientific Advisor de Amazon. Por lo tanto, él está en la frontera de la revolución tecnológica que estamos viviendo. De acuerdo a muchos, entre los cuales me encuentro, tal vez una de las mayores que ha vivido la humanidad, lo que está pasando hoy día. Entonces está lleno de oportunidades, de desafíos, incertidumbre, hay un montón de temores, ¿no es cierto? Pero sí es una gran oportunidad para mejorar el bienestar de la humanidad. Y en eso las universidades tenemos un papel fundamental en la formación de las futuras generaciones para que aprovechen este avance tecnológico para nuestro bienestar. Y por eso en la FEN hemos fortalecido todo lo que es ciencia de datos, ¿no es cierto?, y analítica de negocio, pero no solo ahí, sino que en todo lo que debería ser nuestra docencia, nuestra investigación, en todas las áreas, tiene obviamente que aprovechar esta gran revolución tecnológica que estamos viviendo. Bueno, pero sin más, porque no vinieron a escucharme a mí, quiero dejar con ustedes a Guido Imbens, que nos va a hablar de Causality, Randomized Experiments and Observational Studies. Después de esto vamos a tener alguna conversación y hay un QR para pregunta y respuesta.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for the very kind introduction. And as came up, this is actually the second time I've been here in Santiago, and it's been a very pleasant visit. Very much liked the last time. So what I want to talk about today is about causality in general, and I want to talk a little bit about randomized experiment and give some examples, and then talk a little bit about observational studies and the type of natural experiments I've worked on together with many of my co-authors, including Josh Angrist, with whom I shared the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2021. So kind of first thing I want to mention is something that most people know, that the correlation in the end is not the same as causality. There's many examples of that here. Two of the examples you can kind of find very quickly if you look on the internet. There's a strong correlation between ice cream sales and people getting sunburned. In fact, there's also a correlation between ice cream sales and shark attacks. But in both cases, it's very clear that there's no causal relationship between the two. If we ban ice cream sales, that's not really going to do very much for the prevalence of sunburns, of people getting sunburned. If we ban ice cream sales, that's not really going to do anything for preventing shark attacks. In both cases, there's other mechanisms at play that lead to this correlation, but the correlation itself is spurious. There's no causal relationship. The other one here on this slide kind of is about the correlation between between chocolate consumption per capita and Nobel Prizes per capita in different countries. And you see again there's a very strong correlation with Switzerland doing very well in terms of chocolate consumption as well as in terms of Nobel Prizes. But much as it would be nice if it was otherwise, eating more chocolate is very unlikely to get you a call from Stockholm early in the morning. So if correlation is not the same as causation, what do we really mean by causality? And so the first thing I want to do is kind of talk a little bit about kind of the three key ingredients, the three key components of thinking about causality. And the first one is that when we think about causality, it's really about thinking about comparisons between what we see and what we would have seen in some counterfactual world had some exposure been different. And the example I use in some of my classes is kind of a very simple biomedical example. Suppose I have a headache and I'm thinking about taking an aspirin. What I'm really interested in is what would happen to my headache if I took the aspirin, and what would have happened to my headache had I not taken the aspirin. And the challenge is I can't really see both. I can't really directly measure that effect. If I were to take the aspirin, I see what happens to my headache given the aspirin, but I don't know, and I will never know for sure what would have happened in the world where I had not taken the aspirin. And this is what Paul Holland kind of refers to, in a much quoted phrase, the fundamental problem of causal inference. We're trying to compare two worlds, one which we may actually see. If I took the aspirin, I can see what happens then. And one is a world that we cannot possibly see, the world where I would have done something different from what I actually did. And so causality is always about making this comparison between these two counterfactual worlds where we can see at most one of them. And at some level, that is actually something that resonates very well with economists. That is exactly the way we think about, sort of in a very specific setting, kind of here from a paper by Tinberg, and how we think about supply and demand. When we think about a demand function, we think about not just what sales are given the prices we see, but we think about what sales would have been had prices actually been different, had prices been higher or lower than what they actually are. And we kind of conceptualize what the shape of that demand function is, and we try to infer things about that demand function from the data we see. But what makes that demand function a causal object is the fact that it compares outcomes in different states of the world, in different counterfactual states. So that's really the first component of thinking about causality. It's the fact that it involves comparisons of counterfactual worlds. The second thing is that it's really about the causal effect, not in the abstract, but about the causal effect of a particular intervention. Again, kind of drawing on an example from a class I taught at Harvard a long time ago with Donald Rubin, we talked about the causal effect. So about the specific example was about the cost of child poverty and the effects of child poverty. And my co-teacher Don Rubin had been on a committee where they were discussing the cost of child poverty, and they looked at many studies that essentially compared outcomes for rich kids with outcomes for poor kids. And he was arguing that was very unsatisfactory, and really what they should be doing instead is articulating what an intervention would be like. And that is not, clearly, that is not taking poor kids and putting them in rich families, but it's something like giving these poor families more money, setting up social programs that would give these poor families more resources. And sort of in the discussion in the class that followed on that, our student Bruce Sasserot came up with the idea of looking at lotteries as a way of mimicking such an intervention. And so what we ended up doing in a paper we wrote, in a study we did, is we went to the lottery and we surveyed people who won the lottery. And so for this particular lottery in Massachusetts, like many similar lotteries, if you win $500,000, it doesn't mean you actually get a check for $500,000. What you get is a check for $25,000 every year for the next 20 years. So very much like a universal basic income, very much like an income guarantee, where these families now had a different income stream that was independent of any of their characteristics, of any of their choices, in particular of any of their labor market choices. And so that allowed us to look at the effects of having something like a universal basic income on things like labor supply, on children's outcomes, on retirement decisions, in a way that tied the effect to a particular manipulation. The third key component of thinking about causality is to think about why some units are exposed to a particular level of a treatment and others are not. And here, this kind of leads to a fundamental difference between experiments and observational studies, where in experiments, say in drug trials, we randomize among some study population which units get exposed to a new intervention, say a new drug or a new medical procedure, and which units get exposed to the conventional treatment or a placebo. And what the randomization does, and that's sort of an incredibly important insight, I'll talk a little bit more about it in a second, what the randomization does is guarantee that at least in expectation, these two populations are the same and are comparable, and that any systematic differences in outcomes must be attributable to the intervention. In contrast, and this is the setting we find ourselves in most often in social sciences and in economics, in observational studies, we can't always guarantee that the treatment group and the control group are comparable, at least in expectation. And so if we study, say, the effect of educational achievement on outcomes, something that is of great interest in labor economics, simply comparing people who go to college with people who didn't go to college doesn't give us estimates of a causal effect of education, because there may be differences between the two groups that are due to the prior differences that influence their choice of going to college. People going to college may have had better resources growing up. Their families may be different. They may have different interests. And so we cannot guarantee, and it's a much more challenging task to draw causal inferences from such data. So let me kind of go back for a second to the randomized experiments and kind of think a little bit about where those insights came from and how they developed over time. And much of the initial work in that area was done by Fisher and Neyman in the 1930s. And so the setting there was very different from where we do experiments at the moment, where most of the experiments are done in online settings by some of the tech companies, Google, the Uber, Lyft, the Amazon, Facebook. Instead of these online settings, Fisher and Neyman were focusing on agricultural settings. They were interested in very prosaic questions. Should we put horse manure on these fields or cow manure? What's that going to do for how much corn we grow in these fields? And so the way they designed their studies was they would take a plot of land. You see a picture here from the Rothamsted Agricultural Research Station, where Fisher was the lead statistician. They would take a plot of land, divide it in subplots, put the horse manure on some of the fields and the cow manure on other fields, and then sit back, and Fisher would smoke his pipe and wait till the end of the season to see what the differences were in yields between these fields. And Fisher in particular was very convinced, was very adamant that drawing causal inferences really required randomization, really required control of the assignment mechanism. And to the end of his life, he was unconvinced that smoking was bad for you, and thought there might well be genetic differences between smokers and non-smokers that would lead to different propensities to get lung cancer. And so he was very adamant that the randomization was really the key to drawing causal inferences. And it is an incredibly powerful tool and powerful insight. Here is just a very simple example of a study where someone was interested in the question whether giving kids honey before going to bed would help them if they had trouble sleeping due to the fact that they were coughing. And so they did a small study with 72 children, 35 which were randomly selected to get the honey at bedtime, and 37 who did not. And what you see in just a simple comparison of means between these two groups, that the change in cough frequency for the treatment group was much bigger, much more negative than for the control group, and that the honey did help them reduce the cough frequency. And just a very simple study gives you this very precise estimate, a very credible estimate of what the causal effect of getting the honey is for this particular population. And this type of study, relying on randomization to get credible causal effects, of course, is a big part of the drug approval process in many countries these days, where drug companies cannot start marketing new drugs without having gone through a very regularized system of randomized experiments. And so, in fact, now this is mandated. All drugs need to go through this process before they're approved to go to market. Nowadays, of course, the experimentation is not that solely in these biomedical settings or these agricultural settings. In fact, most of the experimentation is done in online settings by the tech companies. But the benefits of that remain, that the randomization is an incredibly powerful way of ensuring that causal inferences can be drawn in a very credible way. Now, there's widespread agreement on these issues, though not complete agreement. And so here I collected 3 quotes from statisticians and economists on this, where starting kind of with the third, Ed Leem, who was my former colleague at UCLA, wrote that there's a sharp difference between inference from randomized experiments and inference from natural experiments, by which he really means observational studies. And kind of similarly, the Berkeley statistician David Friedman said that experiments offer more reliable evidence on causation than observational studies. Now, the third quote, and so I agree completely with the second and third quote. The first quote is from the economist Angus Deaton, who disagrees. He writes that experiments have no special ability to produce more credible knowledge than other methods. And I give this quote, and it's somewhat taken out of context, not entirely. And there's other parts of the Deaton paper that I agree with very much. This was partly in response to the use of experimentation in development economics, and Deaton was concerned with the fact that economists were possibly ignoring important questions where randomization wasn't very helpful, that couldn't be answered with experiments, and I agree with that part of the paper. But I strongly disagree with this particular quote. In settings where you can do randomization, where you can do a randomized experiment, it is an incredibly powerful way of trying to learn about causal effects. And it's unimaginable to me that, say, the Food and Drug Administration would abandon their focus on the credible randomized experiments and say let drug companies rely on observational studies as part of the drug approval process. Second part for giving this quote is Dean, of course, is also a Nobel laureate from 2014, and I want to stress here that getting a Nobel Prize doesn't necessarily mean that your views on all these subjects are necessarily right, and that you should take what people say with the appropriate skepticism, even after they receive these prizes. So let me give some examples of randomized experiments where I think they've been very helpful. So I started teaching. So my primary appointment at Stanford is in the business school, but I started teaching undergraduate classes again a couple of years ago. And when I was kind of thinking about designing this class, I was talking to some of my colleagues about the fact that a lot of the students nowadays bring their laptops to class and are on their laptops the part of the time or the entire time, especially if they're sitting at the back of the room. And there's some concern that when students are doing that, they may not actually be paying attention to what is being said. And I didn't really like that prospect of staring at a bunch of open screens. In fact, there was an article in the New York Times last year, where they quoted David Leibson, a former colleague of mine from Harvard, who teaches this big undergraduate class. They say when the students show up for class, they focus on the devices. You should know when you're looking at your phone, you're not really hearing what I think he meant saying rather than thinking. I'm not sure. The devices prevent them from hearing what he's thinking. But it's sort of clear that there's concern that students are distracted having these devices. And so I was wondering what to do about that. And Josh Engers, my friend and collaborator, pointed me to this study where they'd actually done a randomized experiment at West Point. And so there they taught this big economics class that was taught in a bunch of different sections, but all with the same faculty and all in the end with the same exam, the same book, the same material. But they randomized these classes, these sections, to some where the students were allowed to bring electronic devices to the classroom, and others where they were not allowed to bring the electronic devices for the classroom. And then they measured the difference in performance on the final exam. And so here's the main result. There were actually 3 groups: unrestricted laptop use, modified tablet-only laptop use, and no laptops, no electronic devices at all. And what they found was quite striking. There was a big effect on the final performance on the exam from the sections that were allowed to bring electronic devices. The students in those sections did substantially worse on the final exam on the course compared to the students in sections where they were not allowed to bring the laptops to class. And so in this class that I teach at Stanford, which is on decision making with data, we discuss how relevant was this for that particular class. It's a different setting, it's a different class, it's a different student population. The electronic devices have evolved and have changed. The students have changed in the way they're used to relying on electronic devices for note-taking. But in the end, my view was that this was compelling evidence that it actually was not good for the students either to have these devices there. And this was the basis for banning students from bringing the laptops to the class there. Now, there were actually additional interesting findings in that study. One of the most interesting ones was one where they split the results by gender, and they found that actually for the women there was no harmful effect on final grades whatsoever. In fact, there was a tiny positive effect, but it certainly was not statistically significant. The effect was all concentrated on the men. Because there is actually observational evidence as well that at that age, maybe at any age, the women are better at multitasking and better at not being distracted by these devices. So we had some discussion on whether the class policy should actually be that we only banned the laptops for the men and not for the women. I was a little worried that the Stanford administration would not be happy if I did that. Though, of course, we did discriminate on other characteristics. There were some students with accommodations where I did not have any choice in allowing for laptops. But it does kind of point to the fact that things can get very complicated. There's also evidence that the effect was different for the students depending on their ability, kind of as measured by ACT scores, kind of high school test scores. And so you could well imagine that there are actually groups who benefit from having laptops in the class and others who don't. But that would introduce a whole bunch of complications where the fact that other students have laptops may lead the students who are not allowed to have laptops to behave differently. So in the end, my co-teacher and I use this as a way of modeling how you should be making decisions with data in uncertain situations. In the end, this was the primary evidence for us to make the decision that students were not allowed to bring laptops to the class. Let me then turn to two other experiments, kind of both related to the use of artificial intelligence methods. And of course, there's a lot of discussion at the moment on what AI is doing for the economy, what AI is doing for people in the labor market, and where it actually helps people and where it doesn't. And these two experiments give very credible evidence that that's a very complicated question, and that it's going to differ very much on the context and the way AI is being deployed. Here's one example where it seemed an unambiguously useful thing. The setting here is a call center where employees were getting calls for help with particular software packages. And this was relatively complex software. These calls would take on average 15 minutes to half an hour to resolve. And the question was whether the people answering these calls, trying to help the customers with this software, would benefit from having access to AI tools to help them get to answers more quickly. And here the results were fairly unambiguous, showing that having the access to AI tools made these call center workers more productive in the sense that they resolved the calls more quickly without reducing the quality of the resolution, the satisfaction of the resolution from the customers. And so here in particular, it turned out that the workers with relatively little experience benefited a huge amount from having access to these tools, was that helped them to draw on all the previous experiences from workers in this call center. Now, a second example led to much more complex results. Here, this was a setting of a management consulting firm where teams of consultants were getting access to the sophisticated AI tools to help them on their consulting tasks. And what the researchers found in that case was that for relatively simple tasks, and because the key word there is relative, for tasks that were what they called inside the frontier, where there was more experience with similar tasks, having AI tools helped substantially and made these teams faster at solving the tasks and led to higher productivity. And in particular, the effect was more pronounced for relatively low-skilled workers in this consulting firm. And so this is very much like the call center example. Here, the AI tools were great. It helped them. It was all good. The challenge came kind of when they looked at other tasks, what they labeled outside the frontier tasks that were more demanding in terms of the expertise of the workers. And there, not only did AI tools not help, it didn't improve the productivity. In fact, it lowered the productivity of the workers. And the mechanism that is suggested there was that having the AI help for the inside frontier tasks made these workers rely more on the AI than they really should be doing for these more complex tasks. And it ended up lowering productivity in those settings. Because the challenge is going to be, if you look at other settings, whether the particular tasks you're looking at are really inside the frontier tasks versus outside the frontier tasks, whether these are things where AI is going to help or not. And these experiments suggest that is a really challenging question, and that AI may not help in other settings. And there have been other experiments, and I'm not going to go through those, where having AI assistance may in the end lead to short-term improvements in productivity measured in some way by some metrics, but may not help train workers as much as doing tasks without AI assistance can do. So the context matters a huge amount. So here one last example here is from an experiment a colleague of mine, Nick Bloom, did about working from home, what it does for attrition and productivity. Here the context was a travel agency in China, where the workers had relatively long commute times. They tended to work kind of very independently, kind of separately, dealing with customers very much in the same way in the call center, the work environment. And what they found was that allowing randomly selected workers to work from home ended up not affecting their productivity very much. It didn't really change how well they worked, but it substantially affected attrition. The fact that these workers had an easier commute made them much happier with their jobs and made it much less likely they would actually leave their jobs. Let me make kind of one comment on some of the modern experimentation. All the experiments I showed so far are still very much in the same vein as the agricultural experiments that Fisher and Neyman were looking at, where we have a treatment group, a control group, and we compare essentially just average outcomes for these different groups. Modern experimentation, modern online experimentation, is in a setting that is often quite different in a couple of aspects. One of them is that units come in sequentially, and we often measure outcomes very quickly. And that allows us to change the allocation of units, of new units to different treatments over time. It's often the question is also not simply comparing two levels of a treatment, but picking an optimal one out of a bigger set of treatments. A political campaign may choose between 10 different advertisements, or a website may choose between 5 different designs for that web page. And so there we can exploit the fact that we learn about some of the treatments quickly to get to good answers faster. And so what multi-armed bandits do is change the allocation of the incoming units of the incoming traffic to the different treatments over time. And so here's an example from an MBA class I taught a couple of years ago, where I had 6 student teams have send a bunch of tasks to Mechanical Turk, pay the workers for these tasks, and at the end offer the workers a bonus. And the task for the student teams was to ask the workers to donate that bonus, not the full pay, but just the bonus, to a particular charity. The particular charity was all the same, give directly, and the focus for the students was on designing a solicitation that would optimize the rate at which the workers would actually donate these bonuses to this charity. And so here you see two of these solicitations, they differ in terms of the pictures they show, they differ in terms of the way they phrase the solicitation. And so what we did there was, in the first stage of the experiment, we focused on 700 participants. We divided them equally between 7 of the solicitations, 6 by the student teams and 1 actually designed by ChatGPT. And we looked at how well they did in terms of the donation probability. And you see there's a fair amount of variation in the probability that these solicitations lead to donations, with the lowest one getting a donation rate of 33% and the highest one getting 73%. Incidentally, the class predictions regarding which solicitations would be very effective didn't seem to be very predictive of the actual success. So again, this shows the importance of actually doing the experimentation. The students couldn't really tell which of these solicitations were effective. But then in the second stage, we focused on the decision which of these solicitations was the most effective, and we designed the second stage of the experiment by sending more traffic to the solicitations that looked very promising in the first stage, using these multi-armed banded designs that maximize the probability of finding that optimize the decision of which solicitation is the optimal one. And so we ended up sending no traffic to the 7th solicitation, because that was already clear that was not a very promising one, and sent most of the traffic to the 2nd and 5th donation, which were the ones that looked most promising. Let me then wrap up and kind of talk briefly about non-experimental methods. Even though experiments, kind of as per these quotes early on, are really the most credible way of drawing causal inferences, in many cases we can't really use them in social sciences. It wouldn't be ethical. In many cases it wouldn't be feasible for financial or other reasons. And so a big part of the economics literature has focused on finding methods for drawing causal inferences in non-experimental and observational settings. And so here are some of the examples from some of the Princeton economists, Eschenfelter, Cart, Kruger, and Engrist, that all fit in what Engrist later labeled the credibility revolution, and that was part of the Nobel Prize citation for Engrist and Cart. So focusing on one of these examples, David Cart was interested in the effect of low-skilled immigration on local labor markets. Would having more low-skilled immigration lower wages or increase unemployment for the native population? And the Cart focused on a particular episode when there was a large unexpected influx of low-skilled labor into the Miami labor market during the Muriel boat lift, when a large number of people migrated from Cuba to Miami. And he used other cities in both Florida as well as in the the southeast as comparisons for Miami, to conclude that in fact this low-skilled immigration didn't really affect wages or employment very much in Miami. Another classic example of one of these natural experiments is the minimum wage study by Engrist and Kruger, where they were interested in the effect of minimum wages on unemployment. And they used the fact that at some point in the early 90s, New Jersey raised the minimum wage, where the neighboring state of Pennsylvania didn't change their minimum wage. They collected data from fast food restaurants in both New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and found that employment over time went up in New Jersey relative to Pennsylvania, to conclude that the minimum wage wasn't really affecting unemployment, wasn't really raising unemployment. Another example is from the study by Engris and Kruger, who are interested in the effect of schooling on earnings. And so they were concerned that people would get more or less education. Who get more education may be different for people who choose to get less education. But they exploited the fact that compulsory schooling laws treat very similar people quite differently. Compulsory schooling laws typically require people to start school in the year where they turn 5 or 6, as measured on a particular date. And so suppose that date is October 1st, that may result in people born on September 30th being treated very differently by these compulsory schooling laws than people born on October 1st. And what you see, in fact, is that the people born on September 30th get on average slightly higher education levels than the people born on October 1st. But that's obviously not due to differences in parental characteristics, that's not due to differences in ability for these students. It's purely due to the differences in these compulsory, to the difference in the birth date, to the way the compulsory schooling laws affect these students. And they use that to get arguably very credible estimates of the effect of schooling on earnings that are not plagued by the standard concerns about ability bias or other confining factors. So I think I'm running out of time here. Let me just mention one more example that I referred to earlier, kind of the study I did with Rubin and Sacerdote, where we're interested in the effect of unearned income on labor earnings, where we exploited the fact that the lottery essentially did the experiment for us by giving randomly selected people, at least among the population of lottery players, giving randomly selected people suddenly this guaranteed stream of income. And we found that having this guaranteed income had only a very minor effect on how much people were willing to work, to the extent of, for every dollar that people would get every year from the lottery, they would earn about 8 cents less per year. So there was an 8% reduction in labor earnings per dollar from the lottery. So in all these cases, the careful attention to why some people are in a treatment group, why some people are in a control group, and a careful focus on the identification and the assignment mechanism allowed for arguably much more credible ways of estimating causal effects than in some of the earlier empirical work that motivated us to go in this direction. Let me then stop here and thank you all for your attention.
Damos las gracias al profesor Imbens por esta presentación y les invitamos también a participar del siguiente segmento a través de preguntas. Recuerden que estará nuestro código QR proyectado en pantalla para que puedan participar. De inmediato queda con la palabra nuestro decano.
Thanks very much, Guido. Quite interesting. And of course, let me just start with one thing that came at the end, and it's quite important. We had also a big discussion here in Chile, is that we have made a very big progress with these natural and randomized experiments to learn about causality, but still there is a lot of debate. And it reminded me in your last slide when you showed the Carl Kruger paper on minimum wage, that there has been a lot of discussion. In Chile we had also very big discussion. So we have made a lot of progress, we have a lot of data, but still we have a lot of doubts. So it's kind of a mixed feeling.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think kind of in many of these cases, one single paper is never really going to be definitive. For one, I think there's going to be a lot of heterogeneity in these effects. Clearly, in the context of the minimum wage, if we raise the minimum wage a lot, that's going to have increase unemployment at some point. I think where the study was very important was showing that the negative effects may not be quite as pronounced in particular settings, and that in the particular setting they studied, where the minimum wage was relatively low by historical standards, the negative effects on unemployment were not nearly as high as people might have expected. But kind of more generally, I think in many of these cases, what you need is lots of different types of evidence. And so going back to one of the other examples about the effect of education on earnings, again, the compulsory schooling example on its own is not really determinative of what the effect is. But there were many other studies that in the end kind of built a body of evidence that suggested that the returns to education were sort of approximately 6 to 8%. There was another set of studies by David Card where he used the distance to college as an instrument. So what he found was that if people live in an environment where there's a college nearby, they're more likely to go to college than if they live in a geography where there's no college nearby. Using that as an instrument, he also found returns somewhere around 8%. Ashenfelter and Kruger did a study where they tried to directly control for differences between individuals and surveyed twins, with twins who chose to get different levels of education. And again, they found returns to education that were on the order of 8%. And so it's really building up this body of evidence that makes these results very credible.
Thank you. And I think that is interesting that you also show in your presentation are this and the links, the causality discussion with the future of work and AI. Because you mentioned the effect that has, for example, on call centers and solving problems and consulting. So with your experience in Silicon Valley, plus what we have learned from economics, how you see the future of work and the tensions that we have with all what's going on today?
Well, I think there's a huge amount we don't really know where it's going, and it's clear that things are changing very rapidly. It's even in the last 6 months we've seen that the coding, how we do coding has changed a huge amount, kind of with Claude code and similar tools. And so I think it's going to be very important that we think very carefully about which tasks are going to be affected by the AI, and kind of make sure that we train people in a way that we prepare them for some of these changes that are coming. I was talking to Gabriel Weintraub earlier today kind of about the work that has been done in the US, kind of where they looked at all these the different tasks and which ones are being affected. And then now here in Chile and South America in general, they're looking at similar questions. And that's going to be really important because in different countries, what tasks are very common is going to be different. And so how AI is going to affect the labor market is potentially quite different. If we see that these call centers are going to be very heavily impacted, they tend to be concentrated in particular geographies that may need to be very careful in how they prepare for these changes coming. So I think the work that is being done here is incredibly important to make sure that that society is going to be prepared for some of these changes, even if we can't see exactly which changes are going to be coming and which particular tools are going to be very helpful.
Yeah, that's great, and that's related to, since the invention of for the assembly line, we have been very worried about the disappearance of jobs, and they have never disappeared. So there is something that keeps them being created. I heard I don't know exactly the evidence, but that when Excel or Lotus appeared, the accounting industry collapsed. But a couple of years later, there were much more people working on accounting because they had the tools. So it's yeah, it's a well.
Yeah,
just
I think we've always kind of been wrong in thinking that these jobs would disappear and no new jobs would come up. But exactly what the new jobs actually are and what skills the people need is very unclear. Because Hinton kind of predicted 10 years ago that radiologists' jobs would disappear, and it turns out that even though AI is incredibly good at helping interpret X-rays, it didn't make these jobs disappear. And in fact, there's more of them now again, just like in the accounting industry, than before. But it does mean people need to be retrained in being effective users of these tools.
I have a couple of practitioners' questions here, so I will read them to you. And one is, what do you think the role of tools such as machine learning in causality studies with experimental and non-experimental studies? And the other question is about empirical studies derived from natural experiment, identify local average treatment effects. How should policymakers and researchers think about extrapolating those local effects when designing large public policy?
Well, so kind of starting with the latter question, that's sort of really the problem I tried to kind of illustrate kind of with the way in which we use the West Point experiment to kind of make decisions for our particular class at Stanford. It's sort of very clear that the West Point study was from 2017. People were using technology in a different way from the way they're using it now. The students may be different. The class may be different. And so we are always, even if we have very well carried out experiments, we're always extrapolating to other settings, to other populations, to another time. We always do the experiments in the past, and we're trying to inform policy for the future. So it's always about doing some extrapolation. And we need to think kind of about the heterogeneity in the effects and how comfortable we are generalizing and extrapolating to other populations. And of course, we do that for medical settings as well, where we are quite comfortable kind of doing experiments for some drugs on some subpopulation and then extending it to other populations. And sometimes it turns out that doesn't work, that things that work for older people may not work for young people, that for some groups don't work for other groups. And we need to be cognizant of that. And when we can do multiple studies and combine experiments with observational studies. What experiments allow you to do is kind of just get very precise estimates, sort of very credible estimates for very particular questions. But it's very rare that directly answers the policy question you're actually interested in. And so you need to embed these estimates in a model of the world that sort of allows you to fit in that evidence and combine it with non-experimental evidence that you're reasonably confident about.
Good. You have been extremely generous in your visit to Chile. We have exploited you a lot. But before just closing, let me just a final exploitation and just a question about your second visit to Chile, and you have seen the university. How you see your impression about Chile and the university and the challenges for the future, what's going on ahead with all the technological revolution and AI?
Yeah, so it's been a very pleasant visit kind of here this time, the previous time as well. So it's definitely been a good experience. Sort of what I've been impressed with, and sort of partly this is based on comparisons with the Netherlands. I'm from the Netherlands originally, at some level. It's a slightly smaller country, but in a similar situation in some aspects. I get the sense here that actually Chile is ahead in the way they try to integrate, to have more collaborations between business and academics, and then actually thinking through how AI is going to affect the world. In the Netherlands, they're also thinking about these problems, but they don't seem to be quite as far along in terms of thinking what they should do to prepare the people in the labor market and society for the changes that are coming, and assessing where the biggest challenges are going to be.
Great. So thank you very much. It has been an honor and a pleasure to have you here. We hope to have you again.
Thank you.
Damos las gracias al profesor Imbens, también a nuestro decano por encabezar esta conversación y reflexiones con nuestra comunidad. Asimismo, les agradecemos a todos su presencia y esperamos que sea un gran año guiado siempre de la excelencia, valor que caracteriza a esta facultad y a quienes la integran. Les pido que permanezcan algunos instantes en nuestra aula magna, ya que finalizamos, como es tradicional, en cada acto oficial de nuestra Casa de Estudios con el himno de la Universidad de Chile. Les invito a ponerse de pie. A todas y todos, muchas gracias por su presencia en esta jornada. Les deseamos a nuestros estudiantes y académicos un exitoso año 2026 en nuestra facultad. Muchas gracias y será hasta siempre.